Well, thank you for the introduction and for coordinating between all the different chapters. This is great. I like the synergy that I'm seeing and hearing about. I should say that I have a special place in my heart for ACS. I've worked with or been part of the ACS group for almost 40 years. And in 1988, I was the proud recipient of a student grant from ACS that helped me do my master's research on California bottlenose dolphins. So thank you very much. There's a long history and connection between me and the various chapters that are out there. Tonight, I want to tell you a little bit about gray whales and kind of my lifetime of research on them. I've been studying gray whales really since the mid-1990s, amongst other species that I've worked with in some in great depth. But gray whales is kind of my pride and joy in terms of my research accomplishments, what we've been able to do, and the places we've gone to learn about them. And so the title of the talk is Getting to Know Gray Whales, My Lifetime of Research. And as part of telling you about my lifetime of research, I like to make my talks a little bit personal. So both it's science, but it's also a blend of kind of my own story and what I learned from the years that I've spent studying gray whales and being in the field and working side by side with people like you. One of the questions that I most commonly get is, how long have you been studying whales and dolphins? And I can actually say that I've been almost my entire life. The picture on the far left is a photograph of me and my younger brother from 1972. And I'm standing there with a pair of binoculars looking off the coast of Malibu, California, and watching gray whales migrate by the coastline. My brother Sam and I knew the migratory timing. We were able to catch the whales going south and going north. And I've ended up making a career out of doing the very same thing. In the middle image there, you can see me and a fellow researcher, Lisa Balance, doing the very same thing in 2019 during our NOAA Gray Whale Abundance Survey. And then all the way on the far right, that is most recently from just about a year ago. And that's me and my son. And I was introducing him on how to do the same type of binocular scans and research that I've been doing for about 50 years now. So when I go to a social gathering and someone says, how long have you been doing what you're doing? I can actually say about 50 years. The other question I most commonly get is, where do you work? And the answer to that is I work for NOAA, which is part of the National Marine Fisheries Service. And NOAA is spread across the country, and NOAA does all kinds of things, most commonly known for weather forecasting and satellite imaging, hurricane chasing, hurricane forecasts. But NOAA has also got a core component of working on protected species. And those protected species include marine mammals, sea turtles, and a variety of all the fish that, in our case, along the West Coast. Our location, our laboratory is located in San Diego on the far right on that map of California. You all know where San Diego is, but pretty much at the southern portion of the state. But our mandate for research is actually California, Oregon, and Washington. So that's kind of our backyard study area. And we're tasked under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act with keeping tabs on how the various populations of marine mammals and also sea turtles are doing. That fisheries center that I work at is located in La Jolla. And for those of you that know the La Jolla area, the red pin there is the location of our laboratory, but probably the milepost that you'll recognize most prominently is the Ellen Browning Scripps Pier, which is at SIO, just down to the left there on this image. So we're on a campus that is composed of Scripps Institution of Oceanography, NOAA NIMS facility where I work, and then just up the hill we have UCSD. And there's a great interaction between all three of those organizations in which we share students, we help train students, interns, volunteers, postdocs, and there's a synergy between the three campuses, which fortunately we're all connected in some way. I'm the director of the Marine Mammal and Turtle Division at the La Jolla Center, and it's a science center, so our job is to produce the science that leads into management. And management, of course, is management and policy. I'm sure you're all familiar with some of the things that we're faced with trying to mitigate or manage in terms of research, and then also threats and risks to populations, whether they're marine mammals or turtles. My division that I direct is about 50 employees. Half of them are federal employees. The other half are either students or postdocs or volunteers or contractors. And I show this slide in terms of the organizational structure of what we do, just so you have a feeling for the science groups. And those are on the very bottom row there. And starting on the left, we've got a group that focuses on the California Current Marine Mammal Assessment that's led by Jeff Moore. And that is where those numbers come from that you're familiar with, like how many gray whales are there in the Eastern North Pacific? That group in our science produces those numbers, as well as all the other numbers that go into the species that occur in Oregon, California, and Washington. We've got a marine mammal genetics program led by Eric Archer, a marine turtles genetics program led by Peter Dutton, a marine turtle ecology and assessment program led by Jeff Semenoff, and then a cetacean health and life history program that is led by Tomo Oguchi, all PhDs and well into their careers as senior scientists. And then we've also got a list of volunteers and affiliates that work with us as well. And some of those are absolutely outstanding, especially our postdocs that come through the lab. Tonight, what I'd like to share with you is an overview on gray whales. And on the right-hand side is just kind of a roadmap for how I'm going to go through the talk. And I want to give you a little bit of a perspective on the Pacific Basin-wide context. And I'm sure that most of you are pretty familiar with gray whales here on our coastline in what we call the Eastern North Pacific. Some of you may be familiar with gray whales on the other side of the Pacific, the Western North Pacific. That's where a lot of my expertise is, but much less is known about that group of animals, and the public is less aware of them. I also want to tell you a little bit about the costs of whaling and how the populations got to where they are today. I'm going to tell you about my science, and when I say my science, it's the science that we've done through NOAA and through my research program with my colleagues. And then share with you kind of a personal adventure that took me over to Russia for almost 15 years, where I worked with some colleagues from the US, Korea, Japan, and Russia on what we call the Western North Pacific Gray Whale Project. All right, let's just take a quick look at the taxonomy of the gray whales. And you can see they're circled in red there. The species is circled in red. And if you were to compare them to a blue whale at the very top or a fin whale just underneath them, they're not all that big. They seem huge in nature. And you know, when you pull up next to one in a whale watching boat or a small boat, or even if you're out surfing or swimming and one swims by, they're enormous to us. A big gray whale is 45 to 50 feet long, something like that. But when you compare them to something like a blue whale, which is 90 to 100 feet long, they seem considerably smaller. This is an important component of the talk as I work through it tonight, and that's the differentiation between the two populations in the North Pacific Ocean. And that is the Eastern North Pacific, and it'll also be referred to tonight as ENP, Eastern North Pacific population, and the Western North Pacific population, or the WNP. Let's take a look at the distribution of these two things. On the left, you can see WNP is kind of on the border of the map, and on the right, ENP is on the border of the map on that side. So let's start with the ENP, the Eastern North Pacific gray whale population. That red ellipse that you're seeing kind of represents the migration for the population. In the summertime and into the late autumn, they're all the way up north at the very top of that red ellipse in the Chukchi Sea, the Bering Strait, and what we call the Arctic Ocean, essentially. That's where they feed. They're absolutely linked to the feeding environment there in order to fatten. Gray whales are unique in that they migrate on a seasonal basis, and during much of the migration, they're not feeding at all. So that summer feeding season up in the high latitudes there in the Arctic seas is really important to their ability to survive and to remain fat enough in order to make a migration that then goes all the way to the southern end of that red ellipse, down to the lagoons of Mexico. So they're migrating on an annual basis 10 to 12,000 kilometers. They start in the summer and fall up in the Arctic Sea. They migrate along the coast of North America and Canada and Mexico, and then they overwinter in the lagoons off of Baja. I'm sure some of you have been there to see the friendly whales in those lagoons. And one thing that I should point out tonight that I've worked almost my lifetime to try and correct is thinking that the lagoons in Mexico they're often called the breeding grounds, but in fact, a lot of the breeding happens during the migration, and the moms with their calves end up in Mexico with calves that are born along the southward migration. Let's switch now over to the other side of this map in the green ellipse, and that's the Western North Pacific. And you can see it covers areas from Russia down to China. And in the high latitude, there's an area called the Sea of Okhotsk, which you can see on the map. And that is the feeding area for the Western North Pacific population. Same as that Arctic feeding area for the Eastern North Pacific. These whales are feeding in the Sea of Okhotsk, especially off of the northeastern coast of Sakhalin Island in Russia. That's during the summer and the autumn. Late autumn, they migrate south into what we think is probably the East China Sea or the South China Sea, but the records are so few there that we've lost track on where the wintering areas are in the Western North Pacific. We've got whaling data from that area. We know what happened in the 1800s, but we're no longer really on top of what's happening with the wintering area for the Western North Pacific population. So let's take a look at the conventional wisdom. And we talked a little bit about that now, but I've added these blue arrows into the equation, and that just represents the migrations. And as I mentioned, the migration is annually, it's about 15 to 20,000 kilometers round trip from, let's take the Eastern North Pacific as the example, from the Arctic feeding areas down to the lagoons of Mexico and then back. That happens once a year, round trip, every year. The Arctic feeding grounds to Mexico wintering grounds is taken place by the Eastern North Pacific population and represented by that blue arrow. And on the Western North Pacific side, represented by the blue arrow, is this north-south migration as well, from Russian feeding grounds to areas off the wintering, off of Asia in the wintering grounds. And you can see up here, summer and winter are represented by their destinations. Let's talk a little bit about gray whale reproductive biology, because this comes into the picture much later in the talk, and one of the mysteries and conundrums that we have in terms of understanding gray whales in the Pacific as a whole and not separated by east or west. But first, let's take that first bullet point and take a look at the mean date of conception, and that is about mid-December. So let's just put a place marker down as 15 December is when most of the mating is happening, and that's the mean date of conception. We know that from whales that were whaled, that were brought on deck and examined, and the females were inspected for the presence of maturing fetuses. The second bullet, mean calving date, is about mid-January. So mid-December is the mean date of conception. Mid-January is the mean date of calving. That equates to a 13-month gestation period, right? Conceived in December of 1 year and then born in January, 13 months later. Many of the burrs occur on the southward migration and near the Baja lagoons. Gestation period, 13 months, as we talked about. Healthy females reproduce a calf about every 2 years. So they're pregnant, they give birth to a calf, they rest, they're pregnant, they give birth to a calf, they rest. Calves are weaned at about 6 to 8 months old, and that happens up on those high latitude feeding grounds, whether it's in the Eastern North Pacific and the Arctic seas, or if it's on the other side of the Pacific, up in the Sea of Okhotsk off of Russia. Those calves make the migration from the southern areas, the wintering areas, to the northern feeding areas. They stay bonded with their moms for some period of time in the feeding areas, learn how to feed, and then become independent of their mothers at about 8 months of age, something like that. Let's talk a little bit about the timeline of whaling and the impacts that whaling had. And on the left-hand side, you can see various pictures. The upper panel is a macaw whaler with a harpoon and the floats that go along with that harpoon. In the middle there are a picture of Koreans actually in the foreground. But those whales were being whaled by Japanese off the coast of Korea. It wasn't the Koreans themselves, but they were there to pose with these gray whales that had been brought into shore in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then down below, that's what we call an American Yankee whaling vessel. So let's switch over to the bullet points now. And I think the takeaway message is that gray whales have been hunted for a very long time. And it began with Aboriginal hunting, whether it was Indian tribes on our side of the Pacific or Aboriginals on the other side of the Pacific. They were added in as early as the 1600s, catching whales in nets and harpooning them and other ways to catch whales for subsistence. In the eastern North Pacific, in about 1846, the American whalers found the lagoons of Baja, and that Yankee whaler at the very bottom there is kind of the ship that they used to transport their crews and bring on the oil and the whale meat onto the vessels. But about 1846, they found the lagoons in Baja, and they had a heyday. They absolutely slaughtered the whales there. They were easy to catch. They were inside the lagoons. Those small whaling skiffs were deployed from those larger vessels. And they took advantage of a very easy target. It was kind of fishing in a barrel, if you will. The amazing thing that I would add, just as on a personal side, if you've not been there, is that same area, the killing grounds for the American whalers in Baja, is now where the whales are friendly. And it's a remarkable twist of nature and twist of cetacean biology and ecology and understanding culture. I don't think I'll ever be able to reconcile how that could have happened, but it has, and it's absolutely remarkable. So I encourage you to get down there to the lagoons and meet the friendly whales if you have a chance. And then all the while keeping in mind that that was also the killing ground for the American whalers back in the 1840s. They had hunted the whales to such low numbers that they started to make their way up the West Coast. And I'm sure you're all familiar about where the various whaling stations were scattered along the coast of California and even to the north. And that happened in about the 1850s. By the late 19th century, gray whales were essentially economically extinct. And what that means is that the whaling ships could no longer make a living targeting only gray whales. And that's when they switched to hunting humpback whales and fin whales and blue whales along the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington. On the other side of the Pacific, the western North Pacific, the Japanese whalers off the coast of Korea were hunting high numbers of gray whales in the 1900s. The American whalers, those same Yankee whaling ships, were also sailing over to China in the 1860s and taking large numbers of whales off of China. Those are some of the last reliable records we have of the distribution and presence of gray whales in that part of the western North Pacific. Like happened in the eastern North Pacific, gray whales became fewer in numbers as they were hunted to near extinction. And so the American whalers started to make their way to the north, just as they did on the East Coast. They also did on the West Coast, and they ended up in the Sea of Akats in the 1840s and 1870s. And took high numbers of gray whales in those areas, in their northern feeding areas. Fortunately, in 1946, official protection by the International Whaling Commission was put into place, and that's really what saved gray whales in the Pacific. Without that protection and regulation on commercial whaling, they probably would have gone extinct. The Western North Pacific population was thought to be extinct in the 1960s. But a few remained, and I'm going to tell you a story about them in just a few slides. But without that official protection, things could have been quite different than they are today, where we celebrate gray whales as being the icon of the California coast or even the coast of Washington and Oregon as well. present day whaling, there still is whaling going on gray whales. And there's a limited aboriginal subsistence hunt that takes place off of Russia. And this is in the far northeastern part of Russia, or far northwestern part of Russia off of Chukotka. And those are by Chukotka villages that require whale meat for the purposes of subsistence to make it through the winter when they can't hunt other land mammals. And there is a pending request by the Makah Indian tribe in the state of Washington to begin to renew their whaling, which has been suspended for almost 100 years or so. They have put in a request, a waiver to the Marine Mammal Protection Act to begin Aboriginal subsistence whaling again in their waters with relatively low numbers of whales, 1 to 2 to 3 per year over the course of a 10-year period. That is, I say, indecision there because it's not been decided by NOAA or the US General Counsel as to whether that waiver to the law, which is the MMPA, will be granted or not. There are catch limits in terms of how many whales can be taken, whether it's in Russia or in the proposal put forth by the Makah. And those catch limits are reviewed by the International Whaling Commission, at least since the 1970s. And the reviews are based upon what the countries are asking for. For example, in Russia, they ask for about 140 whales per year in order to feed the villages that rely on the hunt of gray whales. Within the IWC, the mathematical models are run to look at the population size of gray whales, what we know about their behavior and ecology, population structure, and to determine whether 140 whales can be removed by hunting without an impact to the population in terms of its growth and sustainability. For the Western North Pacific population, the quota is 0. It's not allowed, no hunting of those whales is allowed at all because the population size is so small. But the quota is really meant to meet the hunting community's needs. And that's what is then taken into account by the International Whaling Commission for their assessment on sustainability. Now let's take just a moment to look at the gray whale population status. And in 1994, the Eastern North Pacific gray whale population numbered about 12,000. And at that point, it was removed from the list of endangered and threatened wildlife, or the ESA, the first marine mammal to be downlisted from that list because the government felt that it was doing well, that it had recovered from low numbers and that it was growing, and it was no longer considered endangered or threatened. In 2015, 2016, this is some of my own work, the Eastern North Pacific population numbered about 27,000 individuals. So a very robust, very healthy population, high in numbers, 27,000. However, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we call unusual mortality events in a moment. And between 2016 and 2023, that population of 27,000 declined to 15,000. So it lost almost half of the animals that were in the ENP population in a pretty short period of time from 2016 to 2023. Let's go across the Pacific to the Western North Pacific. The population is still listed on the Endangered Species Act as endangered. It numbers fewer than 200 individuals. And quite a contrast between 200 individuals and 27,000 individuals if you look at them divided on whether they're in the East or the Western Pacific. Same species, but different populations. And then finally, I should mention the Atlantic population of gray whales, which once did exist, was extinct by the early 1700s. However, in the past decade, we have had sightings of gray whales, most recently off of Florida and Nantucket, but also across the Atlantic in the Mediterranean and down off the coast of Namibia in Africa. What that means, I don't really have a clear signal for, but these whales are starting to reappear in the Atlantic. It's most likely due to climate change and the fact that the northern passageways, whether you go over the top of Alaska and Canada or over the top of Russia, they're open during the summer season, and whales can freely move now between ocean basins where even 20 years ago, they were obstructed by ice. And the same is happening for vessel traffic and shipping traffic moving between the Pacific and the Atlantic. And so there's no reason to believe that large whales and even some of the smaller whales are likely to do the same thing over time. And I think that explains these recent 10 or so sightings of gray whales in the Atlantic. So let me tell you a little bit about our research here in the Eastern North Pacific. One of the things we do is we estimate the abundance. And when I say estimate abundance, what does that mean? Abundance is simply how many gray whales are in the Eastern North Pacific population. That number of 27,000 that I gave you earlier, that comes from these counts. So we assemble a team of scientists, me included, up on kind of the northern end of the Big Sur coast. It's just south of Carmel. We've got a field station there, which is in the upper panel. It's called the Granite Canyon Field Station. It's a NOAA property where we deploy between the middle of December and the middle of February, almost every year, but not quite. Sometimes we take a year in between to take a breather. But we count whales as they're migrating south. And it's a full-time job. We do visual observations, as you can see in the bottom panel there with binoculars, but we also run infrared cameras night and day to count whales at night and during weather periods when visual observers can't work. We also do a survey. It's going on right now. It just started on Monday, in fact, and a long-time survey. It's been going on for 30 years. During the northbound migration. And during the northbound migration, what we're interested in counting is how many calves are born into the population. So the southbound migration is abundance, how many whales, and the northbound migration is how many calves. So in this case, we assemble at what's called the Pedras Blancas Light Station. It's a property owned by the Bureau of Land Management. We live there on site for a couple of months. And in the middle panel there, you can see our view looking south, essentially, down the coast of Central California. This is right at San Simeon, if you know where that is in Cambria. And the mother-calf pairs migrate very close to shore. They come right in between those offshore rocks and the coastline. And on the right-hand panel, you can see us with our binoculars, both large and small. We're waiting for them to come, essentially swimming directly towards us so we can count how many calves are born in a given year. Here's the results of both of those, the gray whale abundance on the top and the annual calf production on the bottom. And on the very top panel where it says number of gray whales, you can see that gray line there. In this case, it starts in 1994, but be mindful that we actually began the survey in 1967. We just couldn't fit all the years on a single graphic. And so we decided just to go with 94 to present. But you can see what the population does by that gray line. At the beginning, from 94 to 99, it was stable. It declined during an unusual mortality event in 1999 and 2000. It started to trickle its way up. It went down, it came up, it went down. And then finally, in this period between 2012 and 2016, it really increased at a remarkable rate. Up here is about 27,000 animals in 2015, 2016. But then you can see what happened to the population. It started this persistent decline. And it came all the way down to almost 15,000 individuals by 2023. And that decline also overlapped with an unusual mortality event. Now let's take a look at the number of calves born, and it kind of parallels what you see with the abundance. And it makes sense that the number of calves being born into a population that's not doing well, that's on decline, would be expected to be lower. And so this survey began in 1994. It's gone for 30 years. It's going on today. But you can see the numbers go up and the numbers come down, especially during the UMEs. They spike back up, they come down, they spike up, they go down. And then most recently in the UME between 2019 and 2023, the numbers got very, very low, the lowest that we've seen in this time series of over 30 years. Calf production is an index of how the population is doing as a whole. The population abundance has a lot to do with the quality of food, the access to food, and the availability of food. And so really what we found by studying these time series is that what's happening in the Arctic, in that summer feeding area, summer and autumn feeding area, is critically important to the population dynamics of gray whales, whether it's their total numbers or calves being born into the population on an annual basis. Let's talk a little bit about what a UME is. And the most recent UME, an unusual mortality event, occurred between early 2019, and it was closed. The UME was closed in November of 2023. What is a UME? And it really is an unexpected stranding event that involves a significant die-off of a marine mammal population. This can be seals, it can be whales, it can be seabirds, not even mammals at all. And I think there might be 6 or 7 ongoing UMEs at this moment. In the Atlantic, there's one with humpback whales and North Atlantic right whales. In the Pacific, I think we've got something going on with several pinniped species. Gray whales just ended. But really what the UME suggests is that the number of gray whales stranding and being detected is considerably higher than the past 10 years or so. And that is on a per capita basis. So depending on how large the population size is and how many strandings, it kind of dictates as to whether the UME is ongoing or not. And in this case, for gray whales, the affected animals showed similar signs of relatively poor physical condition. And remember what I just told you about population dynamics being driven by conditions in the Arctic where they're feeding. Poor physical condition is an artifact of poor feeding opportunities and poor prey availability to them. So it's interrelated between what's happening in the Arctic and what's happening during the migration. This gives you an example about the kinds of numbers that we're talking about and where it happened. And of course, gray whales are transboundary. They occupy space between the United States, Mexico, and Canada during their migration. On that bottom panel with the kind of colorful bars, it shows you how many whales were found in the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And the largest number of gray whales were found in the US. Part of that has to do with our fantastic stranding networks and people like ACS on, boots on the ground that are, got an eye on everything all the time. We're able to detect gray whales that are beached or stranded more regularly than some of the regions in Canada and Mexico that are pretty hard to get to and to evaluate and make an assessment. The boxes up above kind of tell you where and what the numbers were for by country and within the United States. And here you can see like Alaska 48, Washington 34, Oregon 6, California 34. That was in 2019. And then if you go all the way to the right of this box, you can see how the numbers have come down from 122 to 44. And in this case, in the box below by country, from 216 in 2019 to 82 in 2023. So this puts it more in the typical range of what we might expect, especially for the US, which is around 44, something like that. And I should say that these strandings happen when the whales are coming back north. So they've got enough fuel in the tank to get them from the feeding grounds to Mexico. But where the first strandings and the UME start to show up is in Mexico. They just run out of gas. They didn't feed well enough to carry them through that portion of the migration in which they're fasting. And for those animals that can leave Mexico and begin to migrate north, they start to come ashore in California, Oregon, Washington, Canada, and Alaska. They're just simply, it's kind of like a Tesla that their batteries have just run to low with no charging station, and they can't make the migration, and they end up dying and washing ashore on the beach. So in addition to those shore-based surveys for abundance and calf production, we also use a variety of other techniques to study individual whales. So those studies are at the population level. These few methods that I'm going to tell you about now that we use at our laboratory to study gray whales are more at the individual level, which then can be scaled up to the population level. In the upper couple of panels, that's just some nice pictures of gray whale flanks, but that's also how we identify them. So a good picture, in our case, of the right side of a gray whale is like a fingerprint. We then know those individuals for at least 35 years in many cases, and sometimes longer. But the markings on their sides and on their flukes are permanent. They do change a little bit, but you can see through the changes and see the permanent features over the course of their lifetime. So we spend a lot of time photographing them, whether it's from a small boat on the left or even from shore on the right-hand side there. In addition to photo identification, when we can get a tissue sample from the same whales that we photo identified, then we can know their sex. For example, is it a male or a female? We're just now starting to crack the code of how to age whales from blubber and skin samples, like that panel on the very bottom. The black is skin, the red is blubber. The way we collect that is by using a crossbow or an air rifle. You can see a picture of me about to take a biopsy up above. In the middle panel there, you can see the arrow flying towards the whale to collect that biopsy. The samples are really small. They're less than an inch long. The darts are modified arrows, essentially. It's not an arrowhead on the end, but it's a coring device, which cores into the whale about maybe half an inch to an inch deep, and it collects a piece of tissue, whether skin and blubber, and the target is both skin and blubber. And then it recoils out of the whale and floats on the surface of the water. We motor over in our boat and pick it up and put the sample away for later processing. In addition to learning the sex of individuals, which is pretty important, we also get their DNA. And that is really powerful in separating population structure. Like, how do we know there's a population in the Western North Pacific and the Eastern North Pacific? It comes from these biopsy samples. Within the blubber, you can look at how they're feeding, stable isotope analysis. You can look at reproductive hormones. And we're just starting to crack the code of how to get age of individual whales from these same samples. So very powerful technique, especially when you combine photo ID and biopsies together. Over the past 15 years, we've invested heavily in using drones, or what we call uncrewed aircraft systems. And that is so we can actually get over to and interact with whales without them knowing that we're even there. So you can see a nice example of how we work at the Central California survey for gray whale calf production. This is my team here. They're flying a small drone. This drone is going to fly out here over the water, and it's going to begin to photograph gray whales as they're migrating by, and in this case, particularly mothers and calves. What can we learn by taking a photo of a gray whale from a drone? We can learn a lot. And you've seen remarkable, beautiful footage. I mean, in addition to just enhancing our ability to admire and see nature in a way that we have not been able to see before, we can also put those images to use for science. And one example of that, amongst many, is this panel down below. So the panel up above, a mother and a calf migrating north off of our Central California field station. And the photo down below is the way that we actually measure total body length. In this case, it's of a female, reproductive female. Her calf is right there. But you can see that we actually take these measurements at increments all the way down the body. And most telling are these areas right here, which tell us the condition of a whale. Is the whale fat like it's supposed to be? Is it somewhere in between, or is it skinny? So we can actually, from these photographs, get an index of the condition. And we know, when we know the condition of, let's say, several hundred gray whales, we can then forecast how the feeding season went for those whales, and how the feeding season may be affected by, or how the population dynamics may be affected by skinny whales, I think, as we've all come to know them as being, but animals in poor body condition. the consequences that may have for population recruitment in terms of abundance and also calf production. So a very simple way from using drones, getting over whales, they don't even know we're there, photographing them, and then using that in a quantitative way to get at some scientific questions. Some of you are probably familiar with what we call satellite tags or satellite linked tags. Here on this panel down here is a tiny little satellite transmitter tag being held by a colleague of mine. This tag is then attached to a gray whale over in this panel in the yellow circle. That same tag in the yellow circle there is on the body now of a gray whale. We place those tags using the same system that we collect biopsy samples. We shoot an arrow at them, but instead of the coring device for tissue, there's an anchoring device on the tag. It attaches to the whale. They eventually fall off and migrate their way out. But while they're on and transmitting in the panel up above, their location is being broadcast to space, to satellites that are orbiting the planet. And those satellites then download data to our laptop computers, and we know exactly where the whales are. And in relatively recent cases with new tag technology, what they're doing. Are they diving? Are they feeding? Are they traveling? Are they migrating? So very powerful technique if you can apply a satellite link tag to a whale. This is one example in which we were asked to try and help understand how gray whales intersect both the Long Beach and the Los Angeles port shipping lanes. And in this case, you don't need to take too much out of these, but we put the tags on in the wintering areas in the lagoons in Baja, and we watched the whales as they migrated north through the Southern California Bight, through the Los Angeles and the Long Beach shipping lanes. And then we did an estimate on what their space use was within this area. So the takeaway from this slide is that by applying a tag to a whale and following it from space, we can actually then assess what the risk is to shipping lanes in this case. And you can do the same thing with fisheries or fishing nets or anything else, but it's a very powerful tool to help answer questions that then can translate into management decisions. So that's what we do in the Eastern North Pacific. I continue to do that to this day. On Sunday, I'll go up to our calf production survey and begin working there with the team. So as I said before, almost my entire life, I've been doing essentially the same thing. It never gets old, and I feel very fortunate to be able to do it as a career and as a job. But one of the things in kind of the last part of the talk here tonight that I wanted to share with you is my time in Russia and what we call the Western North Pacific Gray Whale Project. We began that project in 1997, and it goes on to this day. In 1997, I was just finishing my Ph.D., and my advisor at the time came to me and said, "Dave, we've got an opportunity to go to Russia and study a population of gray whales that we know nothing about." He said, "Are you interested?" And I said, "Yeah, of course. Sounds like a great adventure." We had no idea what we were getting ourselves into, but we knew that it was a conservation issue because at the time, Western North Pacific gray whales were considered data deficient. We didn't know enough about them to assess how they were doing, how close to extinction were they really still there? I mean, that was the very basic question, is could we find them at all? And so this took me on a lifetime adventure that carries on to this day. My Russian colleagues are still at it in 2023, and they're gearing up for a summer field season this summer. We no longer can join them because of the political and social climate going on between Russia and the Ukraine and the politics at play there in the war. But the very scientists that we trained as part of our cooperative program back in the 90s are continuing to collect data to this day. So let me just go back to the same map and refresh your memory about where Western North Pacific gray whales are, right? In this yellow ellipse, the Sea of Okhotsk, and right up here in the northeastern corner of Sakhalin Island is the feeding area for Western North Pacific gray whales. They migrate during the winter time through the Sea of Japan or the Pacific side of Japan, come down into the East China Sea, and probably even get as far south as the South China Sea. So as I said, in 1997, when my professor came to me and said, "Are you interested in going to Sakhalin Island to study Western gray whales?" I said, "Yes, I would love to do that, but I know nothing about Sakhalin Island." And so the first thing that a number of us did that went there was to look up some information on Sakhalin. And we found this really beautifully written book called A Journey to Sakhalin by Chekhov from 1890. And the quote that stood out to me as I was reading that was his characterization of Sakhalin Island, where we were headed, as being hell. And I'm going to tell you that it's not hell. It could be perceived that way, but it's not. And I'm going to share with you a little bit on the personal side about how special a place it actually is. So in this picture, in the yellow circle there, you can't make much out of it, but there is a lighthouse there and a log cabin, and that's where we called home. There's nothing else in this area. There's no roads. There's no Best Buys. There's no fast food. There's not even any cars. There's no way to get in and out of there without going by helicopter. So we were really, as scientists, we were headed into a very remote area that required us to be completely self-sufficient and self-dependent, which made it exciting on the one hand, but it also made it dangerous as hell. Now, in retrospect, many years later, it was very, very dangerous environment for us to be working in. The gray whales, this lagoon is really a magical thing. That lagoon, the gray whales don't go in the lagoon. Here, this is called Piltun Lagoon, like they do in Mexico, but they stay offshore here where all these whitecaps are in the surf. This is where the gray whales can be found feeding. But it's the lagoon effluent that comes through this channel. It feeds the benthos here, and the gray whales assemble here to take advantage of the effluent enriched benthos that are available on an annual basis during the summer. So this is our first trip to what Chekhov called hell. It was to assemble our gear, our boats, our outboards, all of our camera equipment, everything we needed to conduct a summer of research, including food and staff, and pile us all onto these Mi-8 helicopters, which were retired military helicopters, which now, again, in retrospect, were not that safe. When I brought these photos home and showed them to my colleagues here in NOAA, they're like, "You flew in that? Are you crazy? What were you thinking?" But we were ready for an adventure. And most importantly, we were completely committed to learning what was going on with gray whales in that part of the Pacific. This is a picture of the field site. On the left is the lighthouse. It's Soviet era 1963. Constructed, the light still does run, barely, but it does on a diesel generator. And then on the right-hand side is the living accommodations and the radio relay towers that were there on the inner lagoon of Piltun Lagoon in Sakhalin Island. This is where we lived. It was a relatively decrepit housing unit, which is kind of it's more or less a log cabin. And it was built for the lighthouse keepers. And in the Soviet era, there were 2 lighthouse families that lived there and took care of the lighthouse and kept it going. In the current times, it's down to 1 lighthouse keeper family. And the other side was abandoned and became quite decrepit. So we decided that's where we were going to live. And it required us to rebuild it and put in together bunks and other living accommodations so we could survive through the summer and the early part of the autumn there. It was a real adventure. It was, in the very early days, it was 4 Russians and 4 Americans. There was no running water, there was no electricity, there was no heat. And so we needed to collect all of our own wood to cook our food and to heat the cabin. We needed to collect our water from underground well system. You can see us looking down into the well. And oftentimes there were things floating in the water that we did not want to see, and it's being part of our drinking water. But I guess the takeaway message is that this was really an expedition, as the Russians call it, in addition to science. We just needed to do everything for ourselves. There were some of us that came back year after year after year and absolutely loved it. There were others that came for a summer, and at the end of the summer, I would ask them, would you like to come back? And they'd say, Dave, no, thank you. It was awesome. I learned a lot, but I never want to go back. So it's kind of a mixed bag of things, but we loved it. Those of us that were dedicated to it really took a lot away from it. And when the weather was good, we were in heaven. This is sunrise over the Sea of Akats. And we were ready. As soon as the weather came our way, we were ready to get at it and start to collect data. This is an example of our team, small boat team. We worked from Zodiacs because we could bring them onto the beach and keep them in the lagoon at the end of the day. But you can see there in front, my colleague Hyunwoo Kim from Korea, ready to take photo ID. Here's the crossbow poised to take biopsy samples, a Russian student taking video, data recorder from the US, and then Amy Lang, my long-term colleague, as our boat driver in this particular day. We learned a lot, and at the end of the day, when the weather was good, we were tired and it wore us down. But we also spent a lot of time in really poor weather. And the enemy there is the sea fog, in which we can't work when there's fog. You can't go to the sea because it's not safe. You can't see where you're navigating, and there's surf and sandbars and all kinds of things. So the temperature gradient between the tundra where we were and the ocean temperature, the ocean never got much above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was always freezing cold. But the summer days there, even though the summers were short, it would warm the environment to the point that we lived in this really heavy fog. And in any given year, we might be there for between 45 and 65 days. And in one year, 25 of those days consecutively, we were fogged out. So it became kind of like this hostage crisis. We were living in this little log cabin with nowhere to go and nothing to do except for seeing each other and talking to each other. But it made the science even that much harder. We were learning and we were excited to learn, but it came with its own challenges. Winter came very early there. This is a picture from the 1st of September. In the very first couple of years, we learned quickly that if you leave an outboard motor on a boat and you leave it anchored on the water, the outboard motor will freeze like a block of ice. So to make things harder, when the season started to turn, which is pretty early, we needed to bring the boats and the motors up to the cabin and then bring the motors into the house so we could put them next to the wood burning fire to keep them warm so they wouldn't freeze overnight. So as you can see, I think the message is pretty clear. It was hard duty, but boy, did we ever love it. And what we learned was remarkable. And especially from a personal perspective, we were kind of flown in by helicopter and inserted into Russian lighthouse keeper family life. There was nobody else around. It was just them. And every summer there was some turnover in who they were. But here's pictures of us enjoying some vodka with them, celebrating a birthday. We helped them raise their kids on the bottom panel, became friends with them, taught them English, they taught us Russian, we played music together, and we were integrated as Americans, and I think the same holds true for the Russians. It was a remarkable cultural exchange, and keeping in mind, we were there to do science, but the personal benefit of interacting and ingraining yourself into a completely foreign country that was so welcoming. And these people that lived there had nothing, absolutely nothing. But the first thing they wanted to do was to give you anything that they had. So there were lessons learned for me, and a takeaway that I will never replace in my career ever again. This was a really remarkable and special experience for all of us that were able to endure it. And I'm really thankful for that. But what did we learn? I mean, aside from the personal journey and the experience and the enrichment, which I would say really changed my life, what did we learn? We learned a lot. We learned that Western North Pacific gray whales still existed. That was the very basic thing. It's like, guess what, guys? They're still here, and we can find them and we can get to know who they are. We even know them by name and we can recognize them by sight. So the first thing for us to do was to determine, could we reliably find them? And if the answer was yes, then could we study them? And the answer to that was yes as well. So in 2000, just a few years after we started there, we listed the population as being critically endangered. That was under the International Union for Conservation of Nature. In 2018, 18 years later or so, as our studies continued, we changed the designation from critically endangered to endangered. Good news, right? The population had increased from about 100 in 1997 to about 200 in 2022. 200 is nothing to be too excited about because it's very few animals. But we were watching population increase, and this was a remarkable sign that things, to some degree, were going okay for them, and they were increasing. They were increasing slowly, only about 5% over a 20-year period of time, and we would have hoped to see a much higher level of increase in that same period of time. We identified 50 known reproductive females. We followed their calves and their calves. So we knew generations of females, grandmothers and great-grandmothers. And it was really fun to get to know a handful of whales very well. And when a population is only about 200, you can get to know every single individual and who they're related to, and their population structure and their genetics. This second to last bullet point is a really important one. And that was from collecting those biopsy samples in the Western North Pacific, we compared those samples to the same samples we collected in the Eastern North Pacific. And what we found is that the whales in the West and the whales in the East are genetically distinct from each other. So that means that the mitochondrial DNA, the mtDNA that they inherit from their mothers, and then the nDNA or the nuclear DNA that they inherit from both parents is significantly different from whales that we were sampling, gray whales that we were sampling in the Eastern North Pacific. So this allowed us to define population structure. And that's how that one of those early slides, two populations, one in the West, one in the East, it came from these genetic samples. What we weren't able to figure out by studying them only in Russia was where do they go during the winter? We needed information from Japan and China and Korea and elsewhere. So we said, well, using the conventional wisdom, what can we do in order to learn about the southern migration terminus in the Western North Pacific? We knew where they were in Russia, but we wanted to know where they went during the winter at the end of their southbound migration. We knew that whales from Sakhalin Island that we got to know, that we identified, that we biopsy sampled, that we named, whales that we knew from Sakhalin were showing up dead in Asia. And the above picture is of a female, and there was a calf with that female. And it was a whale that we knew from our studies in Russia that ended up entrapped in a net in Japan. And there was also a whale in China that we knew from Russia that ended up in China. So we knew that the conventional wisdom was true, that whales were moving north and south in the Western North Pacific. But we wanted to know where in the Western North Pacific most of the whales were going to. Was it China? Was it Japan? Was it Korea? Where was it? So, as I mentioned to you before, one way to get at that is attach satellite tags to whales. And we went about doing this with our colleague Bruce Mate from Oregon State University. I'm sure many of you know Bruce. He's a longtime ACS supporter and deeply involved with a number of different chapters over his career. But with Bruce and Russian colleagues and Americans, and we went about putting tags on whales in our study area off of Sakhalin Island in order to track them. And what did we find? The panel over here on the left, these are the satellite tracks of whales. And this was completely changed the game. We had no idea that this is our study area in Sakhalin Island. Of the 3 or 4 tags that lasted long enough to give us good data, look at where they went. They migrated from Sakhalin Island over to the coast of North America, and even one of them down to Mexico. we had no idea. What this was telling us is that our conventional wisdom was not correct for all the whales off of Russia, right? It was a complete game changer. We thought we had figured gray whales out. It was kind of textbook. And all of a sudden, by putting these tags on them, it was like, guess what? You actually don't know as much about gray whales as you thought that you did. When we saw some of these whales starting to migrate across the Pacific from the west to the east, we started to do some photo comparisons, those photo identification catalogs that we talked about. And when we compared animals from Sakhalin Island, we were finding matches over here to the coast of North America, whether it was Canada or California or Mexico. But as I told you before, we were also finding matches down here off of China and Japan. So what this was telling us is that those whales that are feeding off of Sakhalin Island in the summer, some of them are coming to the eastern North Pacific during their winter migration, but some of them are staying in the western North Pacific and moving this way. We wrote a couple of papers on this. It kind of turned our science upside down, led us into a whole number of new questions, which is really fun. Science is supposed to progress and raise new questions. The more you look, the more you want to know. And certainly that was the case for gray whales. But it led us to really ponder and to think about, and I still do to this day, how were we finding the genetic differentiation between those whales? So keep in mind that all of our sampling in the western North Pacific was from Sakhalin Island. And the satellite tags and the photography was telling us that those whales that we were sampling, some of them came to the eastern North Pacific in the winter, and some of them went along the coast of Asia during the winter. But we were finding this differentiation between them, right? Separate from each other. And this is really kind of the last slide that I'm going to leave you with. And this is really kind of a cool finding in which is gaining more and more traction as we look at species like humpback whales, in which they share wintering destinations and they have separate summering destinations, or they share summering destinations and have different wintering destinations. And so what these bars and the arrows are meant to represent is that whales coming from Sakhalin Island over here, the mean date of conception we talked about in one of the first slides, mid-December, that means they're mating with each other over here. These are the whales that are migrating over here, right? But they're mating with each other all the way over here in the western North Pacific. The eastern North Pacific population, they summer up here in the Arctic, and by mid-December, when the mean date of conception is happening, this is where they're located, in this purple bar, right? So they're mating with other animals during this time of the migration. These animals are mating with similar animals during that time of the migration, but they're not necessarily mating with each other because the mean date of conception is the same, but they're in very different locations, despite the fact that some of these whales eventually join the purple whales here on the coast of North America. That's what allows the genetic separation to persist, despite the fact that we're sampling purple and orange together at the same time during the summer feeding season in the Sea of Okhotsk. So it's a new concept. I would introduce you to what we're referring to as the migratory herd concept. It's very applicable to humpback whales. Humpback whales have incredibly complex population structure, but gray whales do as well. And just when we thought conventional wisdom fit them well, we found out that conventional wisdom is unconventional and that it actually doesn't work to describe their breeding patterns. So anyway, that's the end of my presentation for this evening. And if you've got any questions or thoughts, I'd be happy to take those.